In the morning of January 22nd, 1879, a British army was sitting in its camp in Zululand. They had guns, they had artillery, and they had trained soldiers. They even had Gatling guns. Basically, they had arrived in Africa with the confidence of someone who has just bought the most expensive phone in the shop. And then, about 20,000 Zulu warriors came over the hills. By the end of the day, the British camp had been completely overrun. Thousands of men were, and one of the most powerful military forces in the world had suffered one of its most embarrassing defeats. But here's the crazy part. The British actually had the weapons to stop them. So how did this happen? This is the story of the Battle of Isandlwana. In 1879, Britain decided it wanted to invade the Zululand. And this wasn't because the Zulus had suddenly woke up one morning and said, guys, let's invade Britain. No! Britain was expanding its influence in southern Africa, and the independent Zulu kingdom stood in its way of British ambitions. The Zulu kingdom was powerful. It had a large and disciplined army, and Britain wanted that kingdom under its control. The Zulu king at the time was Cetshwayo Kampande, and he wasn't interested in simply handing his kingdom over. So Britain sent an army into Zululand, and this army wasn't coming to negotiate over tea. They were coming to fight. The British invasion force was commanded by Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford, and Chelmsford had a serious advantage. His soldiers had modern firearms. They had rifles. They had artillery, and they even had Gatling guns. They were loaded. The Zulus, on the other hand, were famous for their traditional weapons, spears and shields. Spears and shields. And the fighting system developed over generations and generations of war. So if you looked at the two sides on paper, Britain appeared to have had the biggest advantage. But there was one thing Britain badly underestimated. The Zulu army wasn't just a massive crowd of men carrying spears. It was an organized military force. And its commanders knew exactly how to use that particular force. Chelmsford moved his army into Zululand, right? And then they came the decision that would help create one of the biggest disasters in British military. Chelmsford divided his forces. Instead of keeping the entire invasion force together, he took a large portion of his troops away from the main camp to search for the Zulu army. That left the camp at Isandlwana with a much smaller force, and this is where things start getting really uncomfortable, because while Chelmsford was out looking for the Zulus were looking for him. Well, technically they were looking for the British, but you get the point, right? The Zulu army was enormous, like really enormous. Around 20,000 warriors were gathered, and their commanders had a plan. And in that plan, they didn't simply run directly at the British guns like characters in a video game. No, they used a traditional tactical formation, often described as the horns of the buffalo. The center would pin the enemy down. The two sides would move around the enemy's flanks, and the rear force would move in to the block escape. It was designed to surround the enemy. And on January 22nd, that plan was about to be tested. At first, the British didn't even realize how serious the danger was. Zulu scouts had been watching the British positions from afar, and eventually the massive Zulu force began moving towards Isandlwana. The British were caught in a dangerous situation. Their commander, Chelmsford, was away from the camp, and the men left behind had to deal with an army several times larger than themselves. Among the officers at the camp was Colonel Anthony Danford. And soon the Zulu army appeared. Imagine being a British soldier at Isandlwana. You are standing there. You have got your rifle. You have got ammunition. You have got artillery. You are looking across the landscape. And suddenly you realize there are thousands of warriors coming towards you. At this point, somebody probably stopped feeling quite so confident, right? Because the Zulus weren't coming in small numbers. Imagine 20,000 people coming at you. They were everywhere. The British opened fire, and their rifles were devastating. The Martini Henry rifle could fire much faster than a traditional spear could be thrown. The British had artillery. They had trained soldiers, and at first, their firepower caused serious casualties among the advancing Zulus. But the Zulu army kept coming and coming and coming. This is where the battle became absolutely terrifying. The British soldiers were shooting, and the Zulus were advancing. The British were loading. They were loading, and the Zulus were advancing. At some point, you can imagine the British soldiers thinking, surely these guys are going to stop, right? We are busy shooting them. They didn't. They didn't stop. The Zulu commanders began moving their forces around the British position. The horns started closing in. The British line was under increasing pressure, and suddenly the advantage of having modern weapons wasn't enough because the British were being surrounded. The battle turned into close combat. The Zulus pushed forward with the shields and spears. British soldiers fought desperately to hold their position, but their defensive line began to collapse. And once that happened, everything changed. The British camp started falling apart. Men were trying to retreat. Others were fighting wherever they could. The Zulu attack had become too powerful for them. The British position was being overwhelmed. And remember, Chelmsford wasn't there at the time. He was away with a large portion of the army. So while the main commander was out searching for the enemy had found the camp and they were destroying it. The fighting became very brutal. The Zulu warriors broke through the British defensive position. The British soldiers were killed around the camp. Some tried to escape towards the Buffalo River, but escaping a massive enemy force across open ground is not exactly an easy afternoon walk. The British force at the Isandlwana was effectively destroyed. The exact numbers vary depending on how different sources count the troops and survivors, but roughly 1,700 men were killed. Only a small number escaped, and the Zulus had achieved something almost unbelievable. They had defeated a technologically superior British force on the battlefield.